Blackstone Audio presents Ministers at War, Winston Churchill and His War Cabinet, by Jonathan Schneer. This book is read by Matthew Brenher. To Margaret, Ben, and Seth. Introduction. On May 10, 1940, King George VI of England reluctantly accepted the resignation of his Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, and following Chamberlain's advice, asked First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, to form a new government. The King would have preferred to ask someone else, even though, like most people, he recognized that the First Lord possessed extraordinary qualities and talents. But he did not trust Churchill to control them. He judged him to be unbridled, a loose cannon. The disgraced Chamberlain did not trust Churchill either. He would have preferred to steer Britain's highest political post to Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, whom he considered a much steadier personality. But Halifax would not take it, for complicated reasons, while Churchill wanted it badly. During the previous decade, Churchill had occupied the political wilderness, shunned by most Conservatives, largely because he would not toe the party line of appeasement. Finally, with the outbreak of war, when Churchill's counsels had proved prescient, Chamberlain grudgingly appointed him First Lord of the Admiralty in charge of the great British Navy. Now came this further elevation. It marked the climax of Churchill's political rehabilitation and capped his lifetime ambition. Britain stood in deadly peril at this moment. How deadly, no one, not even the Prime Minister-to-be, recognized. Germany, which had taken round one of the war, by defeating Poland in a matter of weeks, and then round two, with lightning attacks that established German control over Scandinavia, had just opened round three. Adolf Hitler had just unleashed a blitzkrieg upon Luxembourg, Holland, Belgium, and France. Panzer divisions were racing through Western Europe, and the Luftwaffe roaring above it, and no countervailing force could stop them or even delay them much. Britain and her French ally were taken by surprise. Germany had pushed them back onto their heels. Indeed, France was nearly on her back. Churchill confronted emergency from his first day in office. This is a book about Winston Churchill and the small group of extraordinary men he selected to help him guide Britain through this great crisis, and about how he and they continued to cope for the next 5 years, until Germany had been defeated. It is a book about Churchill the politician, and Churchill the manager of men, for he had to inspire and direct and chivvy and soothe and manipulate the shifting cast of remarkable individuals who formed his unbeatable team. In these roles he usually succeeded, but not always. It is a book, too, about relations between and among War Cabinet ministers. Churchill stood at the helm, but then right behind him stood the elegant Anthony Eden, whom he would designate his political heir, and his longtime friend the piratical Canadian-born press baron, Lord Beaverbrook, and the human bulldozer who was head of Britain's largest trade union, Ernest Bevin, also the unassuming leader of the Labour Party, Clement Attlee, and Attlee's rival, the ambitious Herbert Morrison, and the puritanical, high-minded socialist, Stafford Cripps, among others. Taken together, these men constituted as tough and as capable a group as has ever governed Britain. It is a staple of the memoirs of such figures that for 5 years they formed a matchless band of brothers, and there is more than a grain of truth to this. Had they failed to cooperate, Britain never could have survived the war. In fact, however, even at the most desperate moments, for example in June 1940, with France on its knees, and the British Expeditionary Force cut off at Dunkirk, facing likely extinction, and Britain itself bracing for invasion, the War Cabinet ministers were continually poking and prodding at one another, and questioning each other's judgment. During the wearying years that followed, some of them began to entertain fantasies about claiming the premiership themselves. 2 took tentative steps to translate this thought into action. The national emergency did not eclipse personal ambition. For all that they were sometimes a band of brothers, certain of Churchill's men warred against each other and their leader, even while they were running the war against the Axis powers. Meanwhile, in the country as a whole, Britons increasingly thought, as the war ground on, that the government should level the playing field of life by providing social security in the broad sense of the term to all citizens. They did not want to return to pre-war conditions. They wanted a new Britain. Why else fight and risk death to save it? They wanted the government to guarantee health insurance, old age insurance, family allowances, free education, decent housing, and full employment. But Winston Churchill had little sympathy with this outlook. Because he had limited interest in domestic policy, he failed to understand the power of the building wave of leftist sentiment in his country. He sought only half-heartedly to satisfy it, and therefore he failed to do so. As for the War Cabinet, it split over the desirability of such measures and over how generous the government should be, if it adopted them. Thus, ideology divided the band of brothers as much as jealousy, personal distrust, and conflicting ambitions did. The ensuing arguments presaged and helped provoke the fractious general election of 1945. Moreover, the growing confidence of the Labour men and the corresponding decline among Conservatives provided a forecast of the election's results, although few grasped this at the time. This book then traces not only personal struggles among Churchill's War Cabinet colleagues, but also an ideological struggle that never ceased, one in which the Prime Minister played a role and that adumbrated the great Conservative electoral defeat of 1945. Practically everybody knows that Churchill was a giant to whom we all owe an unpayable debt. This book will not contradict that judgment. Nevertheless, I hope to have twisted the historical kaleidoscope to reveal familiar pieces in unfamiliar patterns. The internal workings of the War Cabinet, with its complex interactions of conflicting personalities and ideologies, and Churchill's attempts to manage them, and the drama to which the conflicts gave rise, have been too often overlooked. They constitute the main focus of this book. I hope readers will discover in it novel aspects of a story they thought they knew well already. And I hope those who are entirely fresh to the subject will learn much about the remarkable team of rivals who steered Britain to victory in World War II, and about the even more remarkable figure who led them. Prologue. On Monday morning, May 6, 1940, the British light cruiser HMS Aurora cut across the icy waters of Fjord, just offshore from Narvik, a far northern Norwegian port. Winston Churchill, Britain's First Lord of the Admiralty, had sent her there nearly a month earlier. Grey and grim, she cruised the Firth, a menacing portent of the terrible struggle soon to be fought by Great Britain and Germany in the unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic Ocean. On that Monday morning, however, she represented more than a portent to knowledgeable men. All Britain's hopes for any kind of success in the present early phase of World War II focused upon her. For everywhere else in Norway, the British campaign had been disastrous. Aurora served as the flagship of a small fleet of destroyers under the command of Admiral William Boyle, the 12th Earl of Cork and Aurori. A tough, pugnacious sea dog from an ancient Irish aristocratic family, Lord Cork that morning stood upon Aurora's bridge, gazing at the shoreline and at the bombed-out skeleton buildings of the little port. He knew well what his primary objective was and how it should be attained. He must launch a frontal amphibious assault upon the ruined settlement, whatever the odds. He must kill, capture, or disperse the 5,000 German soldiers and sailors who held it. He must do it now, before they received reinforcements. But there were difficulties. The port of Narvik sits on a relatively flat peninsula of land near the end of a long fjord of spectacular beauty. Jagged cliffs and mountains rise up from the water on every side. On May 6, 1940, drifts of snow 5 feet deep in places covered the high ground. They lay as much as 4 feet deep on the flat peninsula below. British forecasters had predicted that the spring thaw would come 2 weeks later than usual this year, even as daylight hours grew ever longer. This meant the British could never surprise the Germans holding the port. The darkness did not last long enough. Moreover, conditions on land would be difficult once they fought their way ashore. The Germans had descended upon Narvik nearly 4 weeks previously, part of a much larger invasion force that took Norway completely by surprise, and simultaneously Denmark, which surrendered practically without firing a shot. They swooped down upon Norway from the sea and from the sky. They captured Trondheim, Bergen, Stavanger, Oslo, and Narvik. Almost wherever they went in Norway, they succeeded, sometimes after bitter fighting, sometimes after no fighting at all. Desperately, belatedly, the Norwegian government appealed to the Allies for help. And Britain, which itself had been planning to take Narvik for her own purposes, and whose plan the Germans unwittingly had forestalled by a single day, hastily sent troops without proper ammunition or guns, or camouflage, or training, or even skis and snowshoes. They sent their main force to relieve Trondheim, where a debacle ensued. The Tommies floundered, hip-deep in snow, perfect targets, black outlined on white, unable even to dodge as Luftwaffe gunners shot them down. In fact, nearly everywhere the Britons met Germans in battle, their enemy defeated them. Shocked, dismayed, furious with the politicians and strategists who had sent them off to war so unprepared and ill-equipped, those British troops who survived fell back all the way to the ships that had brought them there, and that now would bring them home. Only in the far north, at the Ofotfjord, after a first battle of Narvik produced inconclusive results, did British forces in a second encounter score unambiguous victory. There the Royal Navy bottled up the German battle group, denying them access to the open sea. Then the battleship Warspite and 9 destroyers sank or disabled every German ship in the fjord and side fjords. German troops, who had arrived in Narvik by land already, and German sailors who had survived the pounding inflicted by British guns and had found their way to shore, or who had scuttled their ships and rowed ashore in lifeboats, now holed up in a little port, supplied mainly by seaplanes. Lord Cork believed he could have taken the village in a frontal assault one day after the decisive naval battle finished, but at that time he shared command with Major General Pierce J. Maxey, who preferred a more cautious approach. Maxey proposed a land campaign, which he said could not begin until the snow melted. Reluctantly, Lord Cork stayed his hand. He directed his fleet to shell the Germans instead. Now his targets crouched amid the ruins of the village, cold, hungry, weary, even frightened perhaps, but not hopeless. Their comrades held most of the rest of the country. In time they would come to the rescue. Lord Cork understood, as General Maxey apparently did not, that for Britain, time in Norway was running out. Originally, the British had wanted Narvik, because from that port they could have stopped shipments of iron ore, an important resource for the enemy war machine that the Germans transported from Sweden down the long Norwegian coast into the Baltic Sea. Had they taken Narvik, Britain would have commanded all northern Europe's coastal trade. She might have been in a position to stop the German invasion of Norway. Britain's First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, had pushed hard for the occupation of Narvik, but his colleagues had resisted. Some thought the campaign would be a diversion. Some may simply have lacked the stomach for aggressive action. Eventually they approved Churchill's plan. but too late. Now the British needed to capture Narvik for an unanticipated reason, to show the world that Germany was not successful everywhere. The government in London waited with increasing impatience for the telegram from Lord Cork, saying he had redeemed Britain's reputation, and their own, by accomplishing this mission at least. That morning, Lord Cork did indeed send a telegram to the Admiralty and War Office. It arrived at 4:21 a.m. In it he confessed that he was writing, with great reluctance, at the behest of his military colleagues with whom he disagreed. He served now as Commander-in-Chief, above General Maxey, but he must take his subordinates' opinions into account. The message said, in part, "There are insufficient assault landing craft. Men in open boats will be subject to air attack for at least 4 hours. Troops will be unable to dig in on account of rocks and frost. There will be no adequate defence for them." Lord Cork reported that he would like to launch the assault anyway, and that he believed there was a fair chance of success, but that all his military officers experienced in war opposed him. They insisted with General Maxey upon the approach from the ground. When Winston Churchill and his colleagues at the Admiralty Office read this telegram several hours later in London, they must have ground their teeth. Part 1. Making a War Cabinet. Chapter 1. Challenging the Prime Minister. London seemed far removed from embattled soldiers and sailors that Monday morning, May 6, 1940. The week that would end with Winston Churchill realizing his lifelong ambition to become Prime Minister of Great Britain dawned cloudless and sparkling, another perfect morning in a series of such mornings. True, Britain had been at war with Germany for 9 months, but London's peace was not yet much disturbed. There were blackouts at night, which were a nuisance. Unsightly sandbags protected buildings from bombs, and men had dug trenches in the parks to provide shelter should the bombs fall. But none did. It was a period of phony war. The Boer War, Londoners called it, and the longer it continued, the better. They thought that Germany's economy could not sustain a long conflict, but Britain's could. They believed what Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had told them a month earlier, on April 4. The fact that the enemy had not attacked them yet, nor France, meant that Germany's moment had passed. Time was on the Allies' side, and Hitler had missed the bus. On the weekend preceding a crisis that would shake the earth, they appear to have felt few misgivings or forebodings. They filled London's restaurants, which had plenty of food. They attended the theatres and cinemas, as always. The green grass in the parks was fresh. The chestnut trees were in blossom. The bluebells and primroses were out. And the residents of Britain's greatest metropolis took advantage of it all, enjoying their city and the wonderful spring weather. It could not continue like this. The man or woman in the street did not know it, or rather, as news about Norway began to penetrate, may have sensed it, but ignored growing doubts, and walked in the park and dined out anyway. Others who were better informed understood. The German juggernaut had rolled up Poland in a matter of weeks. It had just taken Denmark by surprise, and had conquered that country and most of Norway over a similar period. The disparity between German preparation and Allied procrastination, between German decisiveness and Allied muddle, between German success and Allied failure, was too great. Britain and France, if they continued as they were, stood in grave danger of losing the war. The current British government was not fit to prosecute, let alone win it. The fiasco in Norway further demonstrated this. So on that Monday morning, all along the corridors of power in Whitehall, men met in little groups, in their clubs, in committee rooms, in each other's flats and homes, to consider their political options. A 2-day adjournment debate in the House of Commons before it rose for the annual Whitsuntide recess would begin the next afternoon, Tuesday. The subject for discussion would be Norway, and the Prime Minister would explain what had happened there. This would provide his critics not merely with an opportunity to condemn the government, which some of them had done many times already, but finally with a chance to remove him from office once and for all, if the opposition Labour Party dared end the debate with a vote of censure. But the Conservative Prime Minister had an unassailable majority in the House, more than twice as many votes as Labour. His party whips enforced iron discipline. Few backbenchers in the parliamentary party dared cross them. It would mean an end to all hopes of promotion, from where, then, would come the votes to bring down the government. Equally important, if Labour demanded the vote, and against all odds assembled a majority with Liberal members of Parliament, MPs, and members of splinter groups and dissident Tories, and so finally did dislodge the Prime Minister, who would be the best man to replace him? At 11:30 that morning, Churchill read aloud Lord Cork's telegram to Chamberlain's 8-man War Cabinet, a subset of the much larger cabinet that governed the country. It contained 6 Conservatives, 1 National Liberal, an offshoot of the Liberal Party dating from 1931, and 1 non-party man. All its members, except Churchill, had supported appeasement of Germany more or less warmly before the war, although the Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, developed reservations after Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia in 1938. Now Halifax suggested that opening negotiations with Germany might buy Britain time to prepare Lord Cork's invasion of Narvik. To Churchill, it sounded reminiscent of the earlier approach. He exploded, and the Foreign Secretary backed down. Chastened, he passed Churchill a note. "You are really very unjust to my irresponsible ideas. They may be silly, are certainly dangerous, but are not high treason." The First Lord wrote in reply, "It was a very deadly thought in the present atmosphere of frustration. You could not foresee this. Forgive me." At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the First Lord chaired a meeting attended by the 2 other service chiefs, Oliver Stanley, Secretary of State for War, and Kingsley Wood, Secretary of State for Air. To this Military Coordination Committee, he argued that the texture of the French army required strengthening by British imperial units. He reminded his colleagues of previously agreed strategies should Germany invade Holland, or should a great land battle develop elsewhere on the continent. He drew attention to many significant deficiencies in British war production. The record shows that on Monday, May 6, he displayed comprehension of Britain's tenuous position, and also fortitude. That was what might have been expected from Winston Churchill, for he knew a lot about war, not only from study, although he had studied it much, but also from personal experience and predilection. His father, the brilliant, erratic, ultimately tragic Conservative politician Randolph Churchill, had recognized early his son's penchant for all things military, toy soldiers to begin with. Eventually, he sent him to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, where young Winston joined the 4th Queen's Own Hussars. After graduating, Churchill saw combat at the Siege of Malakand on the northwest frontier in India in 1897. The experience moved him to write that nothing in life is so exhilarating as to be shot at without result. He took part as a horseman in the last great British cavalry charge at the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan in 1898. He fought against the Boers in South Africa in 1899, first while serving as a correspondent for the English newspaper The Morning Post, when Boers attacked the train on which he was travelling, and later as a commissioned officer in General Redvers Buller's army. Captured by the Boers after the attack upon the train, he had escaped and made a difficult journey of 300 miles to rejoin the British. This exploit made him famous. When Winston Churchill went to war, he always sought the most dangerous place, and always demonstrated bravery, determination, originality, and intelligence. Moreover, he wrote about it brilliantly and beautifully. In 1900, Churchill resigned from the army and stood successfully for Parliament as a Conservative. 4 years later, he rebelled against the party's anti-free trade policies and joined the Liberals. In 1908, Prime Minister H. Asquith invited him to join the cabinet as President of the Board of Trade, and in 1911 promoted him to First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill became expert on the Navy as well as the Army.
When World War I began, he advocated the ill-fated landing at Gallipoli as a way to avoid the charnel house in the west, knock the Ottomans out of the war, and take the Central Powers from the rear.
Knowledgeable people understood the complexities of the situation, but Churchill shouldered all the blame and resigned when the campaign failed. He volunteered for service on the Western Front. There again he sought the front lines, as a major with the 2nd Battalion, Grenadier Guards, and as a lieutenant colonel commanding the 6th Battalion, Royal Scots Fusiliers. Unlike so many others, he survived this killing field too, and returned to politics and to cabinet rank. By 1924, he had borne ministerial responsibility for the War Office and the Royal Air Force, RAF, as well as the Admiralty. Then, as the post-war Liberal Party tore itself apart, he reverted to the Conservatives and rose further, becoming Chancellor of the Exchequer under Stanley Baldwin. Everyone knew that Churchill possessed extraordinary qualities and capacities, but he also had a restless bellicosity and taste for combat. In 1919, when he was at the War Office and Iraqis were rebelling against British rule, he produced a minute that said in part, "I am strongly in favour of using poison gas against uncivilized tribes." At about the same time, he helped create the infamous Black and Tans, a group of former soldiers who he sent to Ireland to suppress the nationalist movement. Churchill would not condemn or disown their brutal and bloody methods. During the British General Strike of 1926, his enthusiasm for a showdown with the Unions led the Prime Minister to sidetrack him by putting him in charge of the government newspaper, the British Gazette. On top of all this, Churchill still differed fiercely with Conservative policy over free trade and over policies regarding India. He opposed any move towards self-government, and later over appeasing Hitler. Not surprisingly, the party leaders began to distance themselves. After 1929, they kept him from the front bench altogether. Of course, the very qualities they distrusted were the ones most needed when Britain went to war again. Then, albeit with misgivings, Baldwin's successor as Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, returned Churchill to the Admiralty. "Winston is back," the permanent officials at Admiralty House said, rubbing their hands. "Now the fur will fly." And it did. He wanted to bring the war to the Germans, not to lie back waiting. He meddled in other departments, arguing, dispensing advice, determined to have his way. He thought he knew better than his colleagues how to fight and win wars. To their consternation, he never hesitated to say so. The campaign he advocated in Norway is an example. Yet Churchill, too, had dithered when Germany launched its invasion the day before Britain had scheduled hers. He allowed his military advisers to persuade him first that Trondheim should replace Narvik as Britain's initial objective, and then that he should call off the well-planned frontal naval assault on that town in favour of a pincer movement. Allied troops would converge on Trondheim from Namsos to the north,
and Andalsnes to the south,
unsupported by the navy. But the pincers never came together. The Germans destroyed them both, and now some people were whispering that Churchill remembered Gallipoli and foolishly had sought to make up for it by invading Norway. He should have left it alone. Others whispered the opposite, that Churchill should have overruled his military councillors. He should have insisted upon the sea-borne frontal assault to accompany the pincers, but had remembered the disaster at Gallipoli, and did not dare. The men beginning to plan Chamberlain's fall probably did not think Churchill had lost his nerve. They thought him expert and brilliant, but unbridled. Many of them preferred Halifax, whom they considered a steadier personality. Had Winston Churchill not belonged to the government, then surely on May 6 he would be leading one of the cabals aiming to bring it down. Before the war, he had been its most formidable critic. But in the wake of the calamity in Norway, the First Lord uttered no word of reproach. He could not, since he shared responsibility for it. Indeed, he had been its primary advocate. Moreover, he felt loyalty to the government to which finally he belonged, although most of his present colleagues in the cabinet had derided and shunned him before the war. Churchill's loyalty extended even to the Prime Minister, who privately said that Winston talked too much, that he was bumptious and impetuous, and took unseemly enjoyment in the war, and that his inflated reputation needed bursting, but that he himself could not do it. Yet Chamberlain felt no compunction about asking Churchill to wind up for the government at the end of the coming two-day debate. And the First Lord, who was the Conservative Party's most accomplished speaker, agreed to do it. On that Monday, both men knew that the debate would be sharp, but neither suspected it would end with Labour calling for a vote of censure. The two main opposition parties, Labour and Liberal, wanted more than sharp debate on May 6. They wanted to depose Neville Chamberlain, if they could. Their leaders had refused at the beginning of the war, and then several times subsequently, to broaden his administration when he enthusiastically invited them to join. They hated him. They could not forget how Chamberlain had treated them before he needed them. Like dirt, one Labour man would recall. More importantly, they did not trust him to run the war effectively or aggressively. They would remain outside the government to act as constructive critics. The time will come, prophesied Clement Attlee, the head of the Labour Party, when the nation will demand a change, and when that time comes, we are ready. On Sunday, May 5, Herbert Morrison, another Labour Party leader, went further. I am going to reserve the right to get rid of Chamberlain as soon as I jolly well can. The next day,
as news trickled in about the debacle in Norway,
and as the parliamentary debate loomed, the realization began to dawn among Labour Party leaders that this was the week it might be done. For the first time, they seriously began to consider demanding the vote of no confidence. The majority of backbench Conservative MPs staunchly supported Neville Chamberlain and his government, but a minority of rebels within the party, troublesome young men they have been called, likewise began seriously to ponder a vote of censure that weekend.
some of them belonged to a watching committee led by the 79-year-old 4th Marquess of Salisbury, James Cecil.
This group contained men of influence and experience, as Salisbury termed them, not all of them young either by any means, from both houses. More, belonging to the Eden group, were young and wealthy Conservative allies of the also young and elegantly handsome Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, who had resigned from the government in 1938 to protest Chamberlain's appeasement of Mussolini when Italy invaded Ethiopia. Chamberlain referred sneeringly to them as glamour boys. Now that Eden was in the government again, as Dominion Secretary, a former Conservative Colonial Secretary, Leo Amery, led his group. Finally, Clement Davis, an independent MP who previously had belonged to the Liberal Party and then to the National Liberal Party, led a third parliamentary combination called the Vigilantes. They were members of Parliament from the three main parties, although Conservatives dominated numerically. Cross-membership among the three dissident groups was common, at least for Conservatives. And significantly, Davis had close relations with the leader of the Labour Party, Attlee, and the deputy leader, Arthur Greenwood, dining regularly at the Reform Club with both of them. On May 6, the first day of that fateful week, under the headline, "A New Ministry," the Daily Mail printed on its front page a letter written by a leading member of the House of Commons, whose name is known throughout the world, but who wishes, for the moment, to be anonymous. The author of the mysterious letter was Stafford Cripps, a leading figure on the British left, and an independent MP since the Labour Party had expelled him in January 1939 for advocating cooperation with communists and liberals in a united front against fascism. Cripps did not belong to any of the rebel parliamentary groups. Although he was a formidable, if unorthodox and momentarily relatively isolated figure, at this critical moment his choice for replacing Chamberlain was not Winston Churchill, but Lord Halifax. He called, in addition, for the new ministry to be streamlined, as David Lloyd George's war cabinet had been during World War I. 4 ministers only, Churchill being one of them, with no departmental duties, so they could focus all their energies on the war, would help the new Prime Minister to lead it. The heads of British liberalism agreed with him. Before publishing his open letter, Cripps had approached Lloyd George himself, who was now 77 years old, but still the MP for Carnarvon Boroughs. Lloyd George had replaced Asquith in the middle of World War I as Britain's Liberal Prime Minister, and then against heavy odds had steered his country to victory with the aid of that small war cabinet. In 1918, many called him the man who won the war, but most Conservatives hated and feared him. During the 1930s, they excluded him from the Conservative-led national governments. He had been a giant without a job. Now he agreed with Cripps that Chamberlain must step down, and that Winston could not be PM, and that it would have to be Halifax. On May 3, the morning after he consulted with Lloyd George, Cripps breakfasted with Archie Sinclair, leader of the Liberal Party, sadly diminished since Lloyd George's heyday. Sinclair, a close friend of Churchill's for many years, they had served together in France during World War I, was impressed and favourable and very complimentary at the ingenuity of the list of 4 ministers. Cripps did not approach the Labour Party leaders, who had had nothing to do with him since his expulsion, but they too believed not merely that Chamberlain must go, but that Halifax, rather than Churchill, should replace him. On Monday afternoon, May 6, the day after promising to get rid of Chamberlain as soon as I jolly well can, Herbert Morrison met with Halifax himself. There is no record of their discussion, but Morrison's biographers wrote that he left the meeting believing Chamberlain would soon fall, that Halifax would replace him, and that he would offer Morrison high office in a new administration. Perhaps Morrison reported to Attlee, for the next day Labour's leader warned Churchill's Parliamentary Private Secretary, PPS, that if a new government did indeed take power, his people would expect it to be under Halifax. And the day after that, a close aide to Halifax reported to him that another prominent Labour man, Hugh Dalton, had told him that his party would come into the government under you, but not under the PM, and that this was the view which he and his friends hoped I would pass on to you. So men from all parties plotted the government's downfall. Chamberlain did not need to read Cripps's article to know this. On Saturday, May 4, he wrote to his sister, "I don't think my enemies will get me down this time." By Monday, however, one of his private secretaries was observing that the PM is very depressed, and at the War Cabinet that morning, the permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office, Alexander Cadogan, judged the atmosphere over which Chamberlain presided to be very bad and gloomy. "He is worried about things," reported another knowledgeable observer. "But both he and his friends think that they will weather the storm." This was the meeting at which Churchill and Halifax passed each other notes. Note-passing appears to have been common practice. While everyone else at the Cabinet meeting was discussing the Norwegian situation, Conservative Party Chief Whip David Margeson passed one to the Prime Minister. He was thinking about how the government might spin tomorrow's debate. Labour would not demand a vote of confidence, he predicted, since probably they would lose it. Therefore, we can represent it here and abroad that they, and our own malcontents, did not wish to challenge us or offer themselves as alternatives. In other words, they were scared to. They were cowards. Margeson nearly got it right. Perhaps at the very moment when he passed the note to Chamberlain, Labour Party leaders Attlee and Greenwood were discussing the vote of confidence with Clem Davis of the Vigilantes. Attlee had developed cold feet. Making the announcement before the debate took place, he argued, would give Conservative whips more time to prepare. It might force wavering Conservatives back into line, and if the government survived the vote, it would only be strengthened. It might even call a snap general election, which it would win in a landslide. The Labour Party, Attlee now informed Davis, must reserve judgment on this crucial matter. Tuesday, May 7, was another fine spring day. Churchill attended a War Cabinet meeting at 11:30. He reported that Lord Cork had sent yet another telegram, this one proposing an assault upon Narvik after all, to begin in 48 hours. "I do not believe success is certain, but there is a good chance." The Cabinet ordered Lord Cork not to wait, but rather to proceed at once. Unknown to all except a select few, since the government could not talk about ongoing military operations, hard fighting would follow in snowbound Norway. Britain would occupy the port, and then evacuate precipitously when the focus of the war shifted to Holland, Belgium, and France. Meanwhile, the crowds that had begun to gather that morning in front of the Houses of Parliament were a sign that the popular mood indeed was turning. They knew Norway would be discussed. Perhaps they sensed the Prime Minister's peril. A privileged few filed inside. But the dissident Tories, aware already that Attlee had waffled, were in despair. A member of the Watching Committee wrote to his son, "I am much afraid that the weakness of the opposition will leave Chamberlain at the head of affairs." Another rebel, one of the most active and determined, who belonged to both the Eden Group and the Vigilantes, predicted to two friends with whom he was taking refreshment in the House of Commons tea-room that the government would survive the debate. Perhaps it should, he added bitterly. Let those who have sown the wind reap the whirlwind. Margeson had directed all members of the Parliamentary Conservative Party who could possibly attend to do so. About 20 Conservative members arrived in uniform. They had left their regiments for the debate. Some of them had only just returned from Norway. The glamour boys and vigilantes fell upon them individually and in groups, urging them to disown their leaders in the government. Who knew better than these returning soldiers how poorly prepared and ill-equipped the British troops in Norway had been, and how maladroit and uninspired were most of the men who sent them there? In the House of Commons tea-room, in the smoking room, in the corridors, in the committee rooms, in the bars, even outside on the terrace, overlooking the Thames where members and their guests took lunch, men and women tried to convince each other to support or to oppose the government. Tory rebels tried to persuade the Labour leaders to demand the vote of confidence. Hugh Dalton told Harold Macmillan, the future Conservative Prime Minister who was a member of the Watching Committee, that his party would make that decision the next morning. Macmillan immediately reported the news to Lord Salisbury. Meanwhile, two vigilantes tempted fate by hopefully discussing alternative cabinets. The lunch hour passed, and the debating chamber began to fill. By about 3:30, members had packed it. Churchill took up his position on the Conservative side of the table that divides government from opposition in the great room. He carried no notes. He would not be speaking that day. Behind him rose tiers of seats occupied to overflowing with backbench Conservatives. Labour MPs, across the table, sat facing him in ascending rows. When Chamberlain appeared, they jeered, "Miss the bus! Miss the bus!" an appropriate jibe, given what the Prime Minister had said about Hitler on April 4. At 3:48 p.m., as Chamberlain rose to speak, pale, determined, cold, scornful, they continued to heckle. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, former successful businessman, former Minister of Health, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, son of the great imperialist and renegade radical Joseph, he held most of the Conservative Party in thrall. Those who did not love him feared him, for he set the tone, followed by those party whips. Yet the vast majority of backbenchers did love and respect him, although few knew him well, for he did not invite friendship or confidences. They were content to entrust the fate of the country to his hands. They judged him incisive, supremely competent, a man who did not suffer fools. They believed in his cool judgment, his unemotional self-confidence. Wrote one admirer, "He has a clear and logical mind, and in controversy expresses very forcibly the reasons why it is evident that the opposition is talking nonsense." Chamberlain always thought that his opponents talked nonsense. On that day, at that hour, in that great debating chamber, he felt for his hecklers only chilly contempt. He believed that he had taken their measure during the 1920s, when Labour had opposed his schemes to weaken the power of Labour-dominated local governments, and during the early 1930s, when as Chancellor of the Exchequer he had advocated austerity measures they had bitterly resented. He judged his Labour opponents windy and sentimental. He believed that today Labour would exaggerate the consequences of the setback in Norway for party political reasons. He would correct them. There were no large forces involved. He reminded them condescendingly when he rose to speak. The fact was, it was not much more than a single division, and our losses, therefore, were not really great in number, nor was there any considerable or valuable amount of stores left behind. So loud was the hooting from Labour benches that the Speaker of the House had to intervene to quiet them. Chamberlain blamed the Norwegian government, not Britain's military advisers, for the decision to try to succour Trondheim before Narvik. He blamed Norwegians too for the ensuing debacle. He resisted calls for a more streamlined and efficient war cabinet. Those who called for one did not know what they were talking about. As Labour continued to taunt him, he made a little rather feminine gesture of irritation. But he gave no ground, refusing even to attempt to conciliate his critics. When he finished, he had ceded nothing. At first, the ensuing debate ran along predictable lines. Attlee rose to rebut at 4:45 p.m. He was never windy or sentimental, whatever Chamberlain might think. Nor was he a great public speaker. Still, characteristically, he made the crucial point. It is not Norway alone. Norway follows Czechoslovakia and Poland. Everywhere the story is too late. We see everywhere a failure of grip, a failure of drive. Then Sinclair, speaking for the Liberals, reeled off the series of government failures of omission, commission and judgment that had led to the present disaster, an awful catalogue. The Prime Minister's defenders counterattacked with simple exhortations for unity, then with ridicule, and finally with poisonous insinuation. "The speech of the right honourable gentleman will certainly give great satisfaction in Berlin," said one. Chamberlain's principal private secretary wrote that, at about this point, it was generally agreed that the government was going to get away with it. Two speeches delivered later that afternoon and evening, however, would sweep aside the government defenders and overshadow the orations of earlier government critics. The Conservative Member of Parliament for North Portsmouth, Admiral of the Fleet Sir Roger Keyes, a hero of the previous war for leading a daring and successful raid on German submarine pens in Zeebrugge, Belgium, appeared before the House at 10 minutes past 7 o'clock, wearing his full-dress uniform and rows of medals.
For the past week he had been pleading with the Admiralty to let him attack Trondheim,
with a fleet of old ships, if necessary, so as not to risk the new ones. He had unsuccessfully lobbied Churchill, his friend of many years, to back this assault. He knew he did not speak well in public, so he wrote out his address beforehand to read aloud. That breached House protocol, but when he did speak, no one objected. His words fell like hammer blows, and the rowdy audience hushed.
The capture of Trondheim was essential,
Imperative and vital, Keyes insisted, contradicting the Prime Minister. It would take a brave man to heckle a war hero in full regalia, who spoke with such obvious feeling and authority, but no one did. The House remained silent. I need not go into the details, but I would suggest that if a few ships had entered
Trondheim Fjord,
immediately the army was ready to cooperate.
The capture of Trondheim Fjord with its vital aerodrome for our fighters,
and quays for landing heavy artillery, tanks and our mechanized transport, could have been speedily effected. But the government had refused the naval action at the last moment, while fecklessly pushing forward the two-pronged land attack, thus dooming it. The entire business had been a shocking story of ineptitude, which I assure the House ought never to have been allowed to happen. Keyes turned from describing the inept British campaign in Norway to explaining it. During wartime, inefficiency and incompetence at the top led inevitably to disaster. Like Stafford Cripps, he wanted a streamlined war cabinet with new leadership. Unlike Cripps, he did not think the leader should be Lord Halifax. From his perch above the front bench, he gazed down at his old friend, the First Lord of the Admiralty. Did Churchill meet his eye? Keyes said, to him, as much as to the House at large, "I have great admiration and affection for my right honourable friend. I am longing to see proper use made of his great abilities. I cannot believe it will be done under the existing system. The war cannot be won by committees, and those responsible for its prosecution must have full power to act without the delays of conferences." "The House listens in breathless silence," wrote one who was there. When Keyes sits down, there is thunderous applause. Indeed, the mood had shifted, even from the previous week. The defeat in Norway had changed everything. Men the government was accustomed to count upon had just cheered the man who had condemned it. Clem Attlee, sitting at the centre of the opposition front bench, took note. But now, with Keyes finished, members began to stir. They wanted dinner. The chamber slowly emptied. And still the most dramatic moment of the evening was to come. Leo Amory, temporary leader of Eden's group of glamour boys, wished to speak, albeit not to a vacant house. This formidable politician, administrator and intriguer had been inspired to enter politics by Neville's charismatic father, Joseph Chamberlain, the champion of imperial federation. He had climbed high, serving as a cabinet minister under Baldwin. After Hitler had taken all of Czechoslovakia in 1939, having promised to be content with merely the Sudetenland, Amory had concluded that war with Germany was inevitable, but that Britain was unprepared to fight it, and he said so. As a result, he faced the same brick wall as Churchill. It did not come down for him when the war began, however. Now he played a leading role in 2 of the 3 anti-Chamberlain parliamentary groups. That was why the Speaker of the House, who was a Chamberlain supporter, although supposedly impartial, did not call on him until the chamber was nearly empty. The whole effect of what I had to say depended on the response of a live House, Amory was to write. But the Speaker knew I meant trouble. Amory nearly sat down again. His listeners were so few. But Clem Davis whispered in his ear. He would round up an audience if his colleague could only stall for a few moments. Then, with the leader of the vigilantes racing round the building calling in chits and debts, appealing to members to return to the chamber, Amory cleared his throat, straightened his tie, looked at the ceiling, made a few inconsequential introductory remarks, and checked his watch. He looked around the room again, saw he had at any rate the makings of a house, and launched in. His intention was to bring down the government if I could. He delivered a blistering indictment of the government's approach to the Norwegian campaign, of its failure to anticipate the German assault, of its strategy in combating it, of its explanation for failing to do so successfully, of its assessment of gains and losses in Norway relative to Germany. Members continued to file into the chamber as he spoke, the Conservative benches before and behind him beginning to fill. Amory noticed murmurs of approval and applause coming from them. He took heart. Like Keyes, he found much of the House newly receptive to his argument. The first part of his speech was a prosecution, detailed and bitter. The second part was an urgent call to action. We cannot go on as we are, he charged. There must be a change. First and foremost, it must be a change in the system and structure of our governmental machine. This is war, not peace. But a streamlined war cabinet peopled by Chamberlain's men would not suffice. It must include, or have the backing of, representatives of all parties and of the trade union movement that was so powerful in Britain. The time has come for a real national government. But everyone knew Labour would not join a government led by Chamberlain. The leader of the national government, said Amory, must possess vision, daring, swiftness, and consistency of decision, all but the last of which Neville Chamberlain manifestly did not exhibit. Winston Churchill, however, had them all. Amory did not name him, as Keyes had done, but simply warned the House, we cannot go on being led as we are. Amory's purpose was to overthrow the government, not to name a new Prime Minister, and now he had arrived at the climax of his speech. Even so, he hesitated to say it. Sentences so harsh and wounding, they could never be unsaid or forgotten. He was addressing friends and colleagues on the front bench with whom he had worked closely in the past, including the son of his hero. But he went on. We are fighting for our life, for our liberty, for our all. The newly sympathetic House seemed to agree. He wrote in his memoirs, I felt myself swept forward by the surge of feeling which my speech had worked up on the benches round me. And so he repeated the words he had researched that morning while preparing his remarks, but even then had doubted he would employ. Words that Oliver Cromwell had delivered in 1653 to the Rump Parliament, when he had deemed it no longer fit to conduct the affairs of the nation. Amory extended his arm and pointed dramatically at the front bench, at his old friends and colleagues. You have sat too long here for any good you have been doing. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go. It was 8:44 p.m. He had spoken for 41 minutes and had rocked the House. "The most formidable Philippic I have ever heard," judged Harold Macmillan. "The most dramatic climax to a speech he had heard in 50 years," said David Lloyd George. These were terrible words Churchill would write in his history of the war. There would be other speakers that night, both criticizing and defending the government, but none of them could erase or add much to the impression created by Keyes and Amory. Afterward, men gathered in the smoking room and bars and nooks and crannies of the House of Commons. They stayed for many hours to rehash and rethink and resolve their plans. There is no evidence that Churchill participated in any of these conclaves. But then, he had a great speech to prepare too. The next day, when the debate finally wound down, he would deliver it. He intended a slashing, coruscating defense of the indefensible. Wednesday morning, May 8. Again a perfect blue sky day. At the meeting of the War Cabinet, Chamberlain, who had been offended by Amory's onslaught, nevertheless appeared to be cheerful. Perhaps he took heart from newspaper headlines and editorials, predicting he would survive the debate one way or another. Perhaps he fondly and unrealistically believed, as his private secretary did, repeating gossip he had picked up from the Chamberlain entourage, that if necessary he could assuage his critics by dropping the most visible former appeasers from his cabinet: Samuel Hoare, John Simon, Kingsley Wood, and bringing in Labour men to replace them. Halifax was supposed to put this scheme to Herbert Morrison later that day. Certainly the Prime Minister thought of himself in the same light as the permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office, Sir Alexander Cadogan, who wrote in his diary that day that Chamberlain was still the best PM in sight. In fact, Morrison and the other Labour Party leaders were just then discussing whether to call for the vote of confidence when Commons resumed debate in the afternoon. Attlee had reversed field. He now argued that Labour should demand it. He had witnessed the changed mood in the House the previous night. Probably he had talked with Clement Davis again. Discontent had gone far deeper than we thought, and I was assured that if a division were called, we should get a lot of support from the Conservatives, he would recall. Greenwood agreed. Dalton did not. As for Morrison, later he would claim he had played a decisive role at the meeting, arguing for the vote to be called. Possibly he had come to believe that the demands of the moment trumped whatever understanding he had reached with Halifax on Monday. Today no one knows what the understanding was, since the meeting went unrecorded. Attlee, however, later contended that Morrison came only reluctantly to support the vote. In any event, those at the meeting agreed that Labour should demand one. Morrison would announce it when he opened the debate that afternoon. A little later, before the House met, the Parliamentary Labour Party members ratified their leader's decision. The Watching Committee gathered on the morning of May 8 too, at Lord Salisbury's grand residence at Arlington Street. Committee members did not yet know of Labour's plan, but they needed to decide their own course of action. No ordinary reshuffle of government personnel will do, Salisbury warned them. What did this mean, if not that the Prime Minister must go? And yet Salisbury shrank from the conclusion that his own logic suggested. If Labour should demand the vote of censure, he beseeched members to abstain from voting altogether. Ultimately, he wanted to improve Chamberlain's government, not to overthrow it. More militant members of his committee disagreed. In the end, participants appeared to have left this meeting undecided with Salisbury's advice, but also Amory's speech of the night before ringing in their ears. The 3 meetings wound down for lunch. Churchill retired to put the finishing touches to his speech. When he was due to address the Commons, unlike many MPs, he always entered the House with detailed notes to guide him. He relished the challenge confronting him that day, and the irony of defending men who had frozen him out for the better part of a decade. By 3:45 p.m., the chamber was packed once more. Backbenches crammed, some members wearing their uniforms again, and the tension was nearly as high as it had been at the close of the day before. As scheduled, Morrison rose to begin the debate. It was 3 minutes after 4 o'clock, and as he understood, the most important moment for his country in the war so far. A bantam figure, blind in one eye, probably the best political machine builder Labour has ever possessed, Morrison knew the present government must die if Britain, and not only Britain, was to live. He must puncture the government's pretensions to organisation, efficiency and capacity, and bring the Conservative waverers to the realisation that an alternative had to be found. The speech he then delivered realised his goals brilliantly. A series of specific unanswerable questions about the Norwegian campaign laid bare the government's pretensions to competence. Was there a plan in operation for unity of command between the various forces in Norway? He demanded. Is it the case that AA guns were sent without predictors, and that they were sent a week late? Is it the case that other guns were sent without ammunition? Is it the case that machine guns were sent without spare barrels?
Was there any proper liaison between the port occupied by us at Namsos and the port occupied by us at Åndalsnes?
Were there proper communications between those 2 points? Is it a fact that the military force was not supplied with snowshoes, the consequence being that the troops were stuck on the roads and were bombed there? Is it a fact that territorial brigades were sent, which were 2nd Territorial Army units that had never had even brigade training? His prosecution was relentless, his conclusion inescapable. As Attlee had charged the day before, it was not only Norway that was the problem. The fact is that before the war and during the war, the whole spirit, tempo and temperament of at least some ministers had been wrong, inadequate and unsuitable. I am bound to refer in particular to the Prime Minister. He named other former appeasers too. When Morrison wound up by calling for a vote of censure, no one should have been surprised. Chamberlain, however, reacted with astonishment, and with anger, since usually the opposition gave prior notice if it intended to call for such a vote. But he was confident, for he knew the arithmetic. The opposition could not possibly outvote him. He sprang to his feet as soon as Morrison had ceased speaking. The words which the right honourable gentleman has just uttered make it necessary for me to intervene for a moment or two at this stage. He deprecated the vote because it suggested the country was not united. But I say this to my friends in the House, and I have friends in the House. Here, according to one who was watching, a leer of triumph passed over his face. I accept the challenge. We shall see who is with us and who is against us, and I call on my friends to support us in the lobby tonight. By universal assent, both at the time and since, Chamberlain's appeal to his friends was not merely misjudged, but catastrophic. The Prime Minister seemed to be reducing the vote of confidence to an issue of party fealty, where everyone else understood it to have vaster implications by far. Clem Davis of the Vigilantes knew immediately who could best articulate the sense of the House that the Prime Minister had debased it. He sent word to Lloyd George. So apparently did Morrison, and the Liberal Chief Whip, and Lloyd George's daughter, Meghan, the member for Anglesey. They all knew who should answer the Prime Minister, but at first the old man did not want to intervene. Davis spoke to him furiously in Welsh. He said, "Has the great Achilles lost his skill?" Whoever finally persuaded him, David Lloyd George answered the call. He spoke from the corner seat of the opposition front bench, even though he belonged to the Liberal and not the Labour Party. As he rises in his place, a stocky figure topped by a pure white mane of hair, wrote a journalist for the American Christian Science Monitor. The old fire comes back quickly to light up his oratory, and he begins to wag a minatory finger at the government front bench across the aisle. His voice still has in it the sound of the bells of Criccieth. Some men hoped that Chamberlain would fall, and that Lloyd George would take his place. Many believed this lion in winter would find some role in a new government, even if not the chief role. In fact, his speech on May 8 would be Lloyd George's last major political intervention. He could not have wished for a better swan song. Carefully, Lloyd George took the House through the many failures that had preceded the most recent ones in the Norwegian campaign. The loss of Czechoslovakia and Poland, the forfeiture of the short-lived Franco-Russian alliance, 1935 to 1938, which would have presented Germany with a two-front war, if Hitler had dared to start one, and if Stalin had not lost confidence in it and abrogated the pact after the Western democracies buckled at Munich, and above all, the failure to rearm efficiently and swiftly. Everybody knows that whatever was done half-heartedly, ineffectively, without drive and unintelligently. Lloyd George charged. He tried to separate Churchill from the failures that had taken place in Norway, for he wanted him to continue to serve. I do not think that the First Lord was entirely responsible for all the things that happened there. Characteristically, Churchill would have none of it. I take complete responsibility for everything that has been done by the Admiralty, and I take my full share of the burden.
But Lloyd George riposted instantly.
The right honourable gentleman must not allow himself to be converted into an air raid shelter, to keep the splinters from hitting his colleagues. His peroration did more than any other speech delivered that day to cut the ground from under Chamberlain's feet. The Prime Minister must remember that he has met this formidable foe of ours in peace and in war. He has always been worsted. He has appealed for sacrifice. The nation is prepared for every sacrifice, so long as it has leadership. I say solemnly that the Prime Minister should give an example of sacrifice, because there is nothing which can contribute more to victory in this war than that he should sacrifice the seals of office. Churchill whispered to a Conservative front-bencher, "This is all making it damned difficult for me tonight." And when Lloyd George finally sat down, Churchill delivered his two-word verdict on the speech. Absolutely devastating. There would be additional speeches, including a slashing attack upon the government by Stafford Cripps. But as Cripps himself wrote in his diary late that evening, Lloyd George's effort had been an almost perfect parliamentary performance. Of all the speeches made on the 2 days, Lloyd George's was the only one which showed real leadership and fire. This audiobook is continued on Disc 2.